Welcome. Daniel Defoe is famous mostly for his book Robinson Crusoe, but he also wrote a journal of the plague year. And the plague year was the 1665 bubonic plague in London. I have the Penguin English Library copy with a good introduction by Anthony Burgess, but just searching on the internet, I see that there is a revised edition in the Oxford World Classics, and probably that would be a better one to get if you can. It's interesting to make comparisons with 2020 and the coronavirus. Two main differences stand out. They knew very little about the causes and transmission of the plague. We know a lot. What's more, our knowledge is increasing at a fast pace. Someone pointed out that it took years to sequence the genome of HIV, weeks to sequence the genome of SARS, and just days to sequence the genome of coronavirus. That makes me very glad to be living now and not then. The second main difference is that they were very God-fearing. The subtitle of the book calls the plague a great visitation. This word visitation is used in the King James Bible to refer to God visiting his people, usually for judgment. That idea is extremely unpopular today. But a pertinent question to ask is, why have we discarded that belief? If it was for a good reason, because we have a better appreciation of the great love of God, for example, then well and good. But if it was for bad motives, say because we hate the idea of God having any kind of authority over us, then that's not so good. Defoe was actually only a boy at the time of the plague. He was born in 1660. He narrates the story as if he was an adult, so it's fictional in a way, but it's clear that he did pretty extensive research. Likely he saw for himself some of the things he relates, and other things he would have heard from family members. Well, now let's get into the book. I'll just read short extracts from different places. As we read, let's refrain from judging those who lived in the past for their opinions, and just try to get into their shoes. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is to just read different parts of the book. The first extract I'm going to read comes from page 37. So people were fleeing from London, and he says, I should observe that the court moved out early and went to Oxford, where it pleased God to preserve them, and the distemper, the plague, did not, as I heard of, so much as touch them. For which I cannot say that I ever saw that they showed any great token of thankfulness, and hardly anything of reformation, although they didn't lack being told that their crying voices might, without breach of charity, be said to have gone far in bringing that terrible judgment upon the whole nation. Now we skip over to page 49. The government encouraged the devotion of many people and appointed public prayers and days of fasting and humiliation to make public confession of sin and implore the mercy of God to avert the dreadful judgment which hung over their heads. And it is not to be expressed with what alacrity the people of all persuasions embraced the occasion. They were quick to do it. They flocked to the churches and meetings. You couldn't get near the churches, not even near the doors. Also, there were daily prayers appointed morning and evening at several churches, and days of private praying at other places, at all of which the people attended with an uncommon devotion. Several private families also, as well as of one opinion or another, in other words, different churches, kept family fasts, to which they admitted their near relations only. So that, in a word, those people who were really serious and religious applied themselves in a truly Christian manner to the proper work of repentance and humiliation, as Christian people ought to do. Now over to page 61. So this is now on the topic of trying to figure out what's causing it, and I mean at the natural level, and what to do about it. Bedding and apparel and hangings of rooms must be well aired with fire. So it seems to mean that they're smoking them, and also using perfumes needed within the affected house before they could be taken again to use. So they were trying to cleanse them by fire and by perfume. And then on page 69, he's talking about infected houses. In an infected house, the people were shut in, and a watchman was appointed to make sure that they didn't get out. But he talks about the way that people escape the watchman. They might send the watchman on some errand because it was part of his job to go on any errand that the family sent him to get food or medicine. And then they would take the chance to make their escape. And there's more stories about that. Page 92, and again, they're trying to figure out what's causing it. Someone suggested that the calamity was spread by infection. That is to say, some certain streams or fumes by the breath or the sweat or the stench of the sores of sick persons, or some other way perhaps beyond even the reach of the doctors themselves. Maybe the effluvia, the infection, affected the sound which came within certain distances of the sick, immediately penetrating the vital parts of healthy people, putting their blood into an immediate ferment, agitating their spirits to that degree which it was found they were agitated. And so these newly infected persons communicated it in the same manner to others. Interesting theories, pretty speculative. Now he talks about the charity and help for the poor, the Lord Mayor and the Court of Aldermen, the city leaders, justices of the peace, and the outcasts supported the people with money, so that the poor people were kept quiet. All their wants were everywhere relieved, as far as was possible to be done. So they did quite a bit for the poor. Now here he is talking to a poor man whose family is in bad trouble. The man says, "My wife has a swelling and it is broken. I hope she will recover. I fear my child will die, but it is the Lord." Here he stopped and wept very much. "Well, honest friend," said I, "you have a sure comforter. You have brought yourself to be resigned to the will of God. He is dealing with us all in judgment." "Oh, sir," says he, "it is infinite mercy if any of us is spared, and who am I to complain?" "Do you say so?" said I, "and how much less is my faith than yours?" And here my heart smote me, suggesting how much better this poor man's foundation was on which he stood in the danger than mine was. He had nowhere to run away. He had a family to bind him to attendance, which I had not. And mine was mere presumption, but his was a true dependence and a courage resting on God. But yet still he used all possible caution for his safety. So he didn't just have an idle faith. He was doing all he could as well. Here they are again trying to do something about it. "We were ordered to kill all the dogs and cats. They were hard to catch. They would run away. Maybe they were carrying it on their furs and hair. So the Lord Mayor put out an order on the advice of the doctors that all the dogs and cats should be immediately killed, and an officer was appointed. It is incredible, if their account is to be depended upon, what a huge number of these creatures was destroyed. I think they talked of 40,000 dogs and 5 times as many cats, few houses being without a cat, some having several. All possible endeavours were used also to destroy the mice and rats, especially the latter by laying poison, and many of them were also destroyed. But if it's true, what was concluded later, that it was carried by fleas on the backs of the rats, then killing all the cats wasn't a smart move. But they just, I guess in desperation, they had all these wild theories, and sometimes they acted on them and sometimes they didn't. Sometimes for the better and sometimes for the worse, perhaps. So we're certainly a lot better off today with much better knowledge, although of course there's still a lot that we don't know. Okay, and he's talking again about fires to clean the air. Should they make the fires of wood or coal? What sort of wood? On the whole, the Lord Mayor ordered no more fires, namely because the plague was so fierce that they saw it evidently defied all means, and rather seemed to increase rather than decrease whatever we tried to do. Yet this amazement of the magistrates, I guess he means this, that they didn't know what to do, rather because of, not because they didn't have anything to do, but, oh yeah, okay. It wasn't because they were unwilling to expose themselves or undertake the care and weight of their business, for to do them justice they neither spared their pains nor their persons. But nothing availed. The infection raged, and the people were now frightened and terrified to the last degree, so that, as I may say, they gave themselves up, and, as I mentioned above, abandoned themselves to their despair. But not everybody, as we've seen. Here he says, all the predictors, astrologers, fortune tellers, and what they call cunning men, conjurers, and the like, calculators of birth dates and dreamers of dreams, and such people, were all gone and vanished. Not one of them was to be found. So he mentioned earlier how a whole lot of them had sprung up all over the place. But when the plague got worse, they all disappeared. Here he talks about if somebody with the plague breathes on a piece of glass where their breath condenses, little creatures could be seen with a microscope, strange, monstrous, and frightful shapes such as dragons, snakes, serpents, and devils, horrible to behold. But this I very much question the truth of, and we had no microscopes at the time, as I remember, to make the experiment with. So that's interesting. Just writing a few decades later, they had microscopes, and people began to see funny little creatures under the microscope. But he says further down on the same page, page 214, I found that the nature of the contagion was such that it was impossible to discover it at all, or to prevent it spreading from one another by any human skill. So now he comes back on page 221 to the charity of the rich, as well in the cities and suburbs as from the country, was so great that, in a word, a huge number of people who might otherwise inevitably have perished for want, as well as sickness, were supported and upheld by it. So we read about the charity from the mayor and the city leaders, and now from rich people in general. So that's something really good that happened. Now he talks about the poor doctors trying to apply things to the plague sores, which caused terrible burning and caused the sores to break and run, without which the danger of death was very great, even to the last. But it caused the swellings called insufferable torment, which could make people raving and distracted. Yeah, not very nice. Page 243. It's talking about some physicians, doctors, who left their patients during the sickness. After the plague, now, they came back to town and nobody cared to employ them. They were called deserters, and frequently notices were pinned up on their doors to write verses and scandalous things about them. Also about the clergymen who deserted their posts. People weren't very impressed with them. Now he talks about the prophets who were going up and down the town, prophesying evil tidings every day. Several of them told us that London had not been sufficiently scourged and that sorer and severer strokes were yet to come. So this is after the plague, and they've still got these self-proclaimed prophets wandering the streets. And he goes on to say, if they had been smart enough to tell us that next year London would be destroyed by fire, as it happened in 1666, the next year, then when we had seen it happen, we would have thought, yes, we should have paid some attention to these prophets, and wondered, where they got their knowledge from. But as they kept telling us that we're going to get another plague, and of course it didn't happen, we haven't worried about them since. But because of all their carrying on, they kept us all worried, constantly worried. So they weren't much help to anybody, these guys who were just prophesying doom, doom, more of the same. Page 253. It says, at that very moment when people were saying, we can't do anything, vain was the help of man. That's King James Bible language. In that very moment it pleased God with a most agreeable surprise to cause the fury of the plague to abate, to go down. So they were at their wits' end, and then God stopped it in his mercy. And that's what they're saying. Blessed be God, said a man, let us give thanks to him, for it's all his own doing. Human help and human skill had come to its end. And these are strangers talking to each other. But people would converse like that often in the street, every day. And despite of loose behavior, immoral behavior, the very common people went along in the street giving God thanks for their deliverance, their rescue. Giving God thanks for their rescue. Very interesting to learn about their attitudes, what they did and what they thought, and what all came out of it. So there it is, Daniel Defoe, A Journal of the Plague Year.